Hello everyone, my name is Robin Hunt. I'm a clinical therapist at CAPSA. Mainly through my work at CAPSA, I work with survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. My specialty in particular is working with survivors of sexual assault. I got my undergrad at Utah State University in social work and did my master's in social work at the University of Utah. Today we're going to be talking about taking care of yourself and using mindfulness. I want to make this applicable to the majority of you, a variety of people in different situations. So the way that I set up this presentation was to talk to those of you who are working with youth, who have students, or who need to focus on taking care of themselves when they're working with others who have been through difficult situations. So that could be anyone. I hope that this is applicable if someone comes to you with something difficult, that you have these skills and tools and knowledge to be able to take care of yourself. So what we're going to jump into first is just a definition of what trauma is. Trauma is something that I'm going to reference throughout this presentation. And I love this quote by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, real expert in the trauma field. If you're interested in trauma, he's a great person to look at the work that he's done. So this defines trauma as an experience that overwhelms our capacity to cope. Sometimes when you think about trauma, we think of kind of the extreme of what someone has gone through. If I experience trauma, it must mean that I got beat up or that I was raped, or kind of these high intensity events. Trauma can be anything that is an experience that overwhelms your ability to cope. When you can't manage something because you don't have the skills, and that's very overwhelming and scary, that can be a traumatic event. So as I reference trauma throughout this presentation, I want you guys to think of trauma as something that is difficult and overwhelming, not necessarily a specific event that maybe you have in mind as a crime or being a victim of something violent. Next, we're going to acknowledge how trauma impacts our lives. So trauma is going to impact how we view the world, how we view others, how we view ourselves, and how we view our relationships. So when we acknowledge that trauma impacts us in all of these different areas, we're better able to manage it. And specifically for this again kind of talks about how we're human and we're not robots and we're going to be impacted. So we need to be able to acknowledge our own experiences with trauma or with difficult situations before we can continue to help others. What is vicarious trauma? I want you guys to think about what that word means. We're going to pull up a definition here. Vicarious trauma is what happens in all of these different areas when you listen to traumatic stories day after day or respond to traumatic situation while having to control your reaction. So often when we are helping people, whether it be our kids, students, friends, people that we work with, we have the role to have to control our emotions and react in a certain way as an advocate for that person, as a helper, as a support. So vicarious trauma happens when that happens over and over again, and something that is being shared with us is really difficult and starts to impact us. Compassion fatigue is another thing that I wanted to define right up front. So compassion fatigue is the process where we begin to feel inner exhaustion from caring for others. So when we are in a helping role, when we are an advocate for someone, a support for someone, we usually are trying to be caring and empathetic, and that care and empathy is really important to bring about change. But if it begins to affect the health of the person doing the helping, that's when we want to start paying attention to that experience and what happens. So next we're going to go over warning signs for compassion fatigue, different ways that people notice that this shows up in their lives. So I'm not going to go over all of these. Obviously, all of you guys can see this long list. There's other ones that aren't listed on here that might be warning signs for you, and everyone could experience these differently. To just highlight a couple, a lot of people notice physical ailments when they're starting to be at risk for compassion fatigue or starting to feel burnt out. So I notice for myself that if I'm clenching my jaw or if I'm carrying tension in my shoulders, that's a warning sign for me that I need to pay attention to what's going on with me, that I need to do something to address that before it impacts my ability to help other people in my personal life or in my professional life. Other people notice anger and being cynical, kind of feeling hopeless about the future. Lots of people also, when we are at risk for compassion fatigue, notice being on edge all the time, anticipating that something bad is going to happen, having the sense that you can't do enough to help other people in the world, and feeling like your contribution in whatever way you're contributing as a helper or a support isn't good enough. Lots of people also numb out and start to feel removed from the work that they're doing as they're talking with someone or sitting with someone. And that's a very normal protective mechanism that a lot of people experience, where they're just not having the ability to empathize anymore or to listen, and they might notice starting to avoid different things. So these are all keys that I want you to be aware of and keep in mind if you start noticing them. Also, compassion fatigue exists on a spectrum. All of this that we're talking about, you might start to see little warning signs, and you might recognize that really soon after it starts to happen and be able to address that. Or you might recognize that you're already in a place, or you might get to a place where you're like, man, I'm experiencing a lot of this. I didn't realize how intense my experience was. I need to do some work looking at these warning signs and realizing where you're at. I would really encourage you to be reflective, check in with yourself, know that these are normal, and that you can function best as a helping person, a support, or an advocate when you're aware of these and when you're doing things to take care of yourself. So we know the negative. We know that there's a high percentage of trauma workers or helpers that report these defenses, avoidance, and guilt. Guilt is one that's really common when we feel like we can't do anything to help the person, like their situation is so difficult, and we might feel a little bit helpless and a little bit guilty that we can't do more for them. So that is, the negative side of things. We also want to acknowledge the positives of being in the type of work or the type of role that you have. So positive aspects of working with traumatized people, victims of crime, or being in a situation or a role where you support people. Often this increases personal satisfaction, gives us a sense of meaning and competence and purpose. It may feed into our spiritual well-being of feeling like we are able to connect with people and make a difference for them. We might be able to have a different view of political activity and be more involved in that. And it might also benefit our interpersonal relationships, improve them, and help us be more aware of how to deepen those social relationships. So there is a lot of positive aspects that come from doing the type of work that allows us to help other people and interact with other people. So the main difference between the negative aspects and those positive aspects that we've talked about is resilience. So we're going to emphasize the core elements of resilience. Part of this is the self-knowledge and insight, knowing your strengths and weaknesses, knowing how you can work the best to the best of your ability, knowing about what support is helpful for you, a sense of hope, also extremely helpful. Often we need help from other people to be able to see the big picture, or to be able to put things in perspective, so that we don't get caught in the moment of what we're trying to help the person with. If we have a sense of hope about what could happen moving forward, that is a core element of resilience. And then healthy coping. So we're going to dive a little bit more into healthy coping. Again, this has been set up to talk specifically about if you're at risk for compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma, if you're working with people who may have been through difficult things. So not visualizing what you're hearing from the person that you're working with or helping can be really useful. All of these kind of go together. So visualizing what we are hearing kind of puts us in the crisis with the person who we are interacting with. So it can be really important to keep one foot in our own world while we're doing that work of being empathetic and listening. So there's a couple of ways that I literally keep one foot in your own world that other people might find useful. Often when I'm working with someone and they're needing to talk about a really difficult experience, if I begin to feel like I'm getting lost in their experience, I will wiggle my toes. I'll notice what it feels like to have my hand on my arm. I will adjust my position in my seat. And all of these things, it sounds simple, but it cues us to pay attention to our own experience and be in our own body and in our own world. You can also experiment with if your breathing has changed. Maybe you're holding your breath, maybe you're breathing really quickly. So I've often worked with people where if I take a deep breath and exhale, they follow suit and they're able to be a little bit more calm because I was taking a step of how to keep one foot in my own world and not become part of their crisis. Often our instinct when we're working with people who have been through traumatic things or difficult things is to be really empathetic and meet them where they're at and match their level of either frustration or sadness. And that can be our instinct, and we can control our reaction in a way that's really helpful for them. So acknowledging those feelings, if you're feeling like you want to express the same feelings as the person that you're working with, that makes sense, and you need to acknowledge those feelings. But when we're working with an individual who's been through something difficult, or a group that's been through something difficult, if we are able to stay calm, keep our voice calm, keep our breathing even, and be kind of a person that's a little bit removed, just enough so that we're able to be logical, think critically, that can be of real value to the person who is in crisis, or to people who've been through something really difficult. We don't want individuals who are sharing their stressors and their traumas with us to feel like what they're sharing is too much for even us to hear. If we become really upset with them, the person might get the message like, this is too terrible for even this helpful person to handle, so I need to stop talking about it. I don't need to tell them. I'm going to stop telling people. And we want them to feel like they can have their experiences, and then again balance that with acknowledging what our reaction is, using our own insight, using our good coping skills. So other ideas for coping skills, healthy coping skills that you can use: acknowledging the impact and not denying the feelings that you're having. Giving voice to your feelings can be really beneficial. I work with a lot of survivors of trauma and secondary survivors who've just been impacted by trauma in a more indirect way. They often find that if they're able to state and give a name to what they're experiencing, I feel grief, I'm having the feeling of being angry, I feel sad about this, I feel angry. All of those statements, if we're able to put a name to what we're experiencing, help us by helping us know what to do next, and also can kind of lessen the impact of the emotion if we're able to name it. So seeking out support and identifying your support system is one way that you could use to give voice to your feelings. Support systems can also help give us that outside perspective that helps us reframe the experience in a way that fits the bigger picture or gives us some perspective that we didn't have. Self-compassion is another really important thing that I work on with a lot of different people in different situations. Often we feel like we can be compassionate for others, but we don't give that same compassion to ourselves. And often that self-criticism and that holding ourselves to a high expectation is our way of making sure we improve and we do better. Self-compassion is much more effective for helping us let go of something and move on than trying to avoid it, push it away, or beat up on ourselves because we're having a feeling. Normalizing your own experience for yourself and being self-compassionate about why you're having that experience and what you're experiencing is really beneficial to letting go of what you've heard or seen or experienced or the work that you need to do or want to do, and being able to move forward and shift into a healthier place, those positive aspects of this type of work that we were talking about earlier. So sometimes it's helpful to look at mental health as existing on a spectrum. So this is helpful for that self-compassion and for us being able to acknowledge what we're experiencing. So if we look at that as sometimes we're going to be happy and feel balanced and feel like we are competent and we're doing a good job, and sometimes we're going to be distressed and out of balance. This is not something that stays static. It's going to move. Sometimes we're going to be okay and sometimes we're not going to be okay. That is how the human experience is designed to work. We are going to go up and down on that continuum, and looking at it as a continuum and not, I feel bad, so I must be doing a bad job, really helps us be able to shift more easily when we're having a difficult time. It's okay that we're having a difficult time. It's on a spectrum. Sometimes we're going to be happy and sometimes things are going to be distressing and difficult. Finally, in some of the summary of what we've been talking about, self-care is really critical. Often we feel like the person who works the hardest cares the most or does the best work. Self-care is really critical to being the best helper or the best version of you that you can be. We need to take care of ourselves in order to be efficient at our jobs and be the best helpers that we can be. Trauma Stewardship is the book that this is taken from. I love this quote about using the tool of our curiosity in order to observe these changes that we experience when we're exposed to difficult situations. Looking at this, all of you are perfect and you could all use a little improvement, helps us with that self-compassion, helps us look at our reactions to trauma in a way that we can not have a judgment, and we can work towards improvement. So, shifting a little bit, I really wanted to talk about mindfulness with you, as mindfulness and self-care are both things that I'm really passionate about because they're things that I use in my professional life and my personal life. So I wanted to give a definition of mindfulness that feels straight to the point and not confusing, because we often have a lot of preconceived ideas of what mindfulness is. I love the definition of mindfulness as paying attention on purpose in the present moment and without judgment, non-judgmentally. So often I think our preconception is someone sitting cross-legged with their eyes closed, and maybe they're frustrated because it's really difficult to find that inner peace that we're supposed to be finding. Or people think that mindfulness is supposed to be about clearing our head, and I'm not supposed to think at all during that time. And I think that is really a misconception and something that isn't going to be as beneficial for us as this idea of returning to the present moment and not having judgment for our attention shifting. Our attention is going to shift, and mindfulness is simply the practice of coming back to that present moment and paying attention on purpose. So, other definitions of mindfulness that cover some other things I wanted to talk about. Mindfulness allows us to let go of taking things for granted. So often we get in these habits in our lives where we are doing the same thing over and over again. We get used to the work that we're doing. We get used to helping the people that we need to help in our lives. And it makes it so that we can't see the truly wonderful things that we don't want to take for granted. So mindfulness and being able to pay attention and observe in that present moment may allow us to be more positive, have more gratitude for what we do have, and have this different perspective about our day-to-day lives and the things that we often do take for granted. Kind of how I talked about previously, mindfulness means returning to the present moment. That misconception about always staying in the present moment, that is not really a possible thing for the way that our brain is designed to work. Our minds are designed to wander and get distracted, but mindfulness can be such a core practice to bring some inner peace and some relaxation and some perspective that we don't always have. Often we tend to follow our minds wherever they go, and if we're worried about something, we think about that, or if something's making us upset, we think about that, or if something happened in the past, we're thinking about that a lot. And that returning to the present moment focus can be such a wonderful tool for dealing with difficult things that have been coming up. So this final definition, mindfulness is self-regulation of attention and using that attitude of curiosity, openness, and acceptance. We wanted to go over some examples of mindfulness practices that you can use. And the body scan is one that is something that I really enjoy and something that has been really effective for people that I've shared this with. So the body scan is just the practice of paying attention to each body part, scanning through the body and paying attention non-judgmentally to each body part, the sensation, what each body part feels like. Often we are just walking around in our bodies and not observing what's going on with us. So earlier I was talking about clenching my jaw a lot, and there have been times in the past and there will be times where I don't recognize it until I've been doing it for a little while. So tuning into our body, checking in with how we're feeling can be really beneficial and powerful tool, especially if people are experiencing things or have experienced things in their body. And I really appreciate you can find lots of ways to do this practice guided, so that someone leads you through each body part and reminds you to focus and pay attention. You're going to be distracted during this practice, but I find that that's a really powerful mindfulness practice for me. Mindful seeing, and using the senses in general. Seeing is one that is usually something that people tend to focus on already. So with mindful seeing, we're simply observing what we see around us and paying attention to that and bringing our attention back when we get distracted by thoughts we're thinking. So for example, if we're using mindful seeing as a mindfulness practice, this one's really accessible because we can kind of do it in a variety of situations. There's always something to look at. If I was mindfully sitting in front of the window watching the rain, I would say it's raining and observe that it's raining, use my eyesight to see what that looks like. If I was using other senses to be mindful of, I might hear the sound of the rain. I might notice that it smells different. All of these things that I'm just observing and not attaching a judgment to. As opposed to if I was mindfully seeing the rain and I noticed that it was raining. I'm looking outside and I say, I don't like the rain. I'm gonna have to go out in that today. That means it's gonna be a horrible day. I don't wanna do that. And I start attaching all these emotions and judgments to this experience. And we could end up in a totally different place if we are experiencing a mindfulness practice versus not experiencing a mindfulness practice. Obviously, we're not going to be able to walk around being mindful all the time. Sometimes we need to think about the past or the future or plan things. But mindfulness is really beneficial as a practice and as a skill that then starts to impact our perspective and our ability to see things a little bit differently. Mindful breathing, the final example of a mindfulness practice. This is maybe one that people think of most commonly when we're thinking about mindfulness. Paying attention to the breath. Again, this can be really beneficial because your breath goes with you everywhere. That's something that you're going to have with you at all times. And the breath is a great regulator of the nervous system and the body, which can be really useful for people who've been through high stress situations and tend to have a reaction to things that they perceive as high stress. Another really beneficial area for mindful breathing is teenagers that tend to, their brain is still in development, and so they tend to jump to an impulsive choice or decision. Mindful breathing and mindfulness in general can be a really useful skill to teach them. If you haven't done any practices focused on mindful breathing, would really recommend it. There's lots of different varieties, lots of different practices. So if you stumble across one and you're like, I didn't really like that, like try other options and resources. One of my favorite ways of practicing mindfulness is just being aware of the breath, not trying to breathe in a certain way and just observing what that's like. And again, it might be really relaxing to you and it might not be really relaxing to you. The goal of mindfulness is not to be relaxed. The goal of mindfulness is to be in the present moment and kind of exercise that muscle of paying attention in the moment. Finally, I wanted to wrap up with types of self-care. So if we were doing this conference in more of an in-person situation, I would have each of you write out types of self-care that fit under each of these categories for you. You can take your time and do this if you would like to, but I'd like to look at the different categories and types of self-care. So this one has listed spiritual, physical, mental, and emotional. Often ways that we're taking care of ourselves will overlap multiple categories. So if I decide that yoga is a really important type of self-care for me, it might allow me to have a mental break, it might help me process my emotions, it might help my physical body, and it might be a spiritual practice for me. So it's okay if you are thinking of a self-care practice that overlaps or that only fits one. So emotional self-care, I often recommend reaching out to other people, journaling, being aware of our feelings and being able to state what the feeling is can all fit under emotional self-care. Mental self-care is the balance of keeping our minds active and giving our minds breaks. Spiritual self-care can look different for everyone. So sometimes religion is the way that people access spiritual self-care. Sometimes religion isn't the way that people access spiritual self-care. Spiritual self-care for one individual might just look like I connect with family, I make sure I'm doing good in the world. Some people might connect to a higher power through a spiritual ritual. And some people might recognize that the way that they want to do spiritual self-care is through getting outside and being in nature. Anything that makes you feel connected to others and makes you feel like you're experiencing something outside of yourself can be really wonderful spiritual self-care. Physical self-care is one that often pops in our head right away when we're thinking about self-care, because we usually think, I want to eat right and I want to exercise and I need to be doing these things for my health, which is great. We want you to take good physical self-care. Ones that people don't often think of or kind of push off to the side because we're focusing on that exercise and eating healthy are things like getting enough sleep, staying hydrated, making sure you're drinking enough water during the day, making sure you're feeding yourself regularly. It's really hard for our bodies to do the work that we need them to do without getting regular fuel in the form of food. And I really encourage people to look at physical self-care as a way to be kind to ourselves, a way to feel good. So even in diet and exercise, do movement that feels good and joyful for you. Eat things that make you feel good, both physically and emotionally. It is okay for you to take care of yourself by having ice cream one day and having kale the next day. That is balances everything with this. And making sure you're taking care of yourself with that self-compassion really helps us look at all of these different categories and decide what's the most important, what I really need, and being able to meet my needs without guilt, so that then I am better able to help other people and continue to do the meaningful work and live the meaningful life that you want to be able to live. So thank you so much.